This is Autoline After Hours with John McElroy and Gary Vasilash, episode 589 for February 17 of 2022, phase-out strategies for the internal combustion engine. Watch Autoline After Hours live at Autoline.tv every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 12 p.m. Pacific. You can subscribe to this podcast for free by searching for Autoline in iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Hey, Gary.
John, how are you?
Doing well, doing well. We got a hot topic for our show today.
We surely do. And I think we should get right into it.
Let's bring in Lindsay Brooke from SAE Engineering, who's joining us. Hello out there in digital world land, Lindsay.
Hi, John. Hi, Gary. Thanks for having me.
Glad you're back. And let's bring in James Martin, Associate Director, IHS Markit Automotive Advisory Practice. James, welcome back.
Hey, good afternoon. It's good to be back with you guys.
Great.
James, it was great to have you on the show. I think it's been a couple of years, more than a couple of years now, probably pre-COVID for sure. And I know that you were the resident expert on powertrain stuff. Now you've broadened what you cover. But let's talk powertrain for right now. Let's talk ICE engines. Just to kick things off, where do you see this going? I mean, clearly we're in the final stages. It's going to last a while, but we're in the final stages of the ICE age. I mean, is that how you see it? I kind of think, give it another 10 years and there ain't going to be a whole lot of ICE engines in the major markets, China, Europe, US.
And that's the part that's critical. In the major markets, in China, US, Europe, we're going to see ICE dwindle at a faster rate than what we talked about the last time we talked. And you're right, John, it was pre-COVID. And when we talked then, I think the quote that may have stuck with you guys that came from me was the ICE engine is saying, I ain't quite dead yet. I'm still not predicting death, but I am predicting a very severe diet. Okay, we're going to lose a lot of weight in the ICE world.
But I mean, give us a sense of what you see in terms of timing. I mean, so in 2040, several countries have said at that point, you can't sell a new vehicle that's an ICE vehicle But I mean, are people going to be waiting till 2039 before they pull the plug on their ICE engines?
If you're talking about it from a manufacturer standpoint, yeah, I think that is the case. I think that most of the manufacturers are going to try to judiciously draw back, probably do it on a platform by platform basis and try to reduce their scale footprint for each of the major engine product families as they go along and cause as little disruption as possible. But it's hard to see this happening without some level of disruption. When you look at the size in terms of volume of some of these engine platforms, it's just going to be really too difficult to bring them down in a real, relaxed fashion. There's going to be some stress in the system.
James, what impact on current vehicle or current engine platforms will oncoming regulation have? We've got Euro 7 coming in Europe, and we've just handed over basically North America to California. And I've always seen that as a way for government to kind of force the consumer into electric cars. What are you seeing in that regard? The engine families that are out there right now, how are they going to change because they have to stay in production until those vehicles aren't sold anymore?
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing in that area, there's not so much of a push from the regulatory side. I mean, from what I'm seeing, a lot of the automakers are actually already out ahead of the regulation. It's why there wasn't any pushback to, let's go back to prior to 2020, when there was a move to relax some of the regulation. The automakers didn't push back on that because they had already invested towards technologies to meet those regulations. So drawing back didn't benefit them at all. I think that what we'll see now, that there's more of a push towards electrification, is that automakers are going to look at their portfolio of product, identify those that have to be upgraded, and those are going to be the ones that are wound down and trickled down to very low volumes. Forgive me if I stand up here. The light in this conference room kind of goes out if I'm not moving enough.
Go ahead, James. Do the hokey pokey for us and get those
I'll
lights
just stand up
on.
and stretch a bit, and that's as much exertion as you guys are going to get out of me today.
Smart lighting.
Energy savings.
Yeah.
But again, I think that's going to be part of the decision from the automakers in terms of which products are going to be wound down and replaced. And then those replacements will, of course, be electric or at least strongly electric assisted. I mean, hybrids are still in the game. We can't forget that. Not everybody is going to have access to a plug to be able to charge at home. So there's still going to be ICEs that are electrically assisted through hybrids, through plug-in hybrids. And so the focus for technology will be on refining those products to keep those in play.
Does IHF see any all new engine programs? Are they dead right now, or are there still some in the works?
New engine programs, yes. Platforms, no. And let me explain the difference there. And I'll pick on GM since I spent many years working there. If you look at the small block V8 platform, that's everything from a 5.3 liter in a Tahoe up to a 6.6 liter in some of the medium duty trucks. That 6.6 is a very new product, and our understanding is there may be another product or at least a refinement on that 6.6 coming later. So even though GM has said we're going to be out of the ICE business around 2035-ish, they're still developing new product. You've got the new 6.2 liter engine, mid-engine Corvette, the engine there in the C8. There's going to be a twin turbocharged variant of that going into a vehicle beyond the Z06. We're expecting that. So it's a new program, but it's not a new platform.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So, James, how do you think this is going to go for the industry? Because when I talk to some of the senior leadership in the business and ask them, how are you going to wind down your ICE operations? You know, what's going to happen? They don't want to talk about it. And I'm not sure if they're reluctant to talk to a journalist, you know, openly about it. Because as you know, it's a sensitive issue. There's a lot of jobs tied to this. The UAW has got its hair on fire as to what could happen with anybody involved in powertrain manufacturing. But I also think maybe part of it, the reluctance of these executives to speak, is they really don't know what they're going to do yet. How do you see it?
I think it's both things. I think it's, you know, a part of it is the plan is not fully baked yet. And some of that plan, you know, has to come together looking at not just what is the impact on our operations. I mean, we're going from a scale of hundreds of thousands of a particular type of engine a year down to tens of thousands and eventually out. But there's also a concern in and for the supplier community. If you're a leader at one of the big three, you know, Ford, Stellantis, GM, you've got to be concerned about your supply base, because if you start to wind product down too fast, you're upsetting their economies of scale and you're upsetting their employment base. And guess what you're doing when you do that? You're upsetting your supply base. So what you may have planned as a strategic and well-managed wind down in volume of a particular engine program or platform might now become chaotic when your rod supplier says, I got to close shop. Now what do you do? So, yeah, I think they're very closed-mouthed about that for a reason, because it's a very tightrope that they've got to walk to be able to do this in any sort of a manageable fashion.
James, do you see this transition occurring smoothly around the world, or will there be differences from market to market, segment to segment?
There will be differences market to market, but I think it's also going to be more driven by the manufacturer and their approach to implementing strategy than it is going to be by vehicle segment. With the larger manufacturers, engine product crosses vehicle segment. I talked about the GM small block goes into Tahoe and goes into Corvette. Two wildly different segments, but you have to make a decision along those platform lines on how you're going to wind that whole platform down. And then in region to region, each region is dealing with their own set of regulations and pressures from government and non-government organizations in terms of how and when they phase product out. And then, of course, you've got the trade unions and the labor unions that are going to want to have a say in it. So there's going to be differences in how these get implemented regionally. And to say that it'll be smooth, I hesitate to say that any of this will be smooth. It's just going to be a matter of managing your way down to the transition as smoothly as possible, understanding there's going to be stress.
So is it possible there's some sort of Hail Mary out there, technology that's going to save the internal combustion engine? We keep hearing more and more chatter coming out of Europe about synthetic fuels, i.e. Fuels, drop-in fuels can go right into your gas tank, right into your engine, no modification. The whole fuel delivery infrastructure that's out there for gasoline could handle these fuels. They don't have any carbon in them. So all of a sudden, your internal combustion engine is no longer part of the whole worry about climate change. But what do you think about synthetic fuels?
I think when you're talking synthetic fuels, and we've also gotten a couple of questions recently about ICE hydrogen, and they have a couple things in common, and that is it's the C, it's the combustion. And when there's combustion, there's emission. And when there's emission, somebody's screaming and saying, what part of zero do you not understand? So whether it's a nitrogen-based emission or a carbon-based emission, somebody is going to have a problem with it not being zero emission.
I didn't realize that. So these synthetics are not purely zero emission fuels.
No, and neither is hydrogen ICE.
Very interesting.
So a hydrogen fuel cell would be zero, but not a hydrogen ICE.
That is correct.
And so it comes back to somehow you'd have to fire the spark to make the hydrogen explode to drive the engine, and that's the problem.
Exactly. And whether you do it by spark or whether you do it by compression, at some point in time, there is a combustion event, and that combustion event is going to result in work and is going to result in some form or another of emission.
I'd also heard, I hadn't seen anything factual, but I've heard that these synthetic fuels, not including any taxes or anything, are about $9 a gallon. So I think that would be an issue too. Yeah.
Now, where I think those are going to have a place is in motorsports. And when you look at who's really behind the push for the synthetic fuels, Porsche. So if you are one who frequently drives your Porsche at a road track or any other competitive venue, you're used to paying those kinds of prices for fuel. So it won't be a big deal there. But productionizing that and making it available globally, gas station on every corner that sells synth gas. I think we're far enough away from that by the time that could become a reality, you've already got EVs in the system, in the market, zero emissions, and the momentum is there. You're not going to turn that around anytime quickly.
Yeah, I was going to say, John made a good point about these hydrogen and synthetic fuels. Recently, I interviewed the global head of powertrain at Bosch, which has, they've got to have their hands in just about every propulsion game that's out there, electric through all these IC engine alternatives. And he said it really is market by market. He said the Japanese are really trying to develop a hydrogen-based economy, both with hydrogen-fueled ICs and with fuel cells. And he said China's latest 5-year plan has a lot of synth fuel and hydrogen kind of push in it. So do you think it's really going to be, North America is going to be really different?
I think that when it all shakes out, China, and I'm going by size of market, China, Europe, North America will all be very largely electric based, a lot of zero emission based on battery electric. There will be a fairly sufficient amount of electrified ICE hybrids, probably more plug-in hybrids in Europe, probably more non-plug-in hybrids, full hybrids in North America. But those three regions combined is about 75% of the market, about 75% of the global market. Then if you walk down to the next largest global market, it's Japan, South Korea. And they are both continuing with more or less an ICE-based hybrid market, with fuel cell, hydrogen fuel cell coming in later as kind of the optimized version of a hybrid. And it makes sense for them when you think about it, because one thing we don't necessarily pay attention to a lot is geography. And if you look at the geography of Japan, it's an island. The biggest drawback for hydrogen fuel cell, and what's slowing it down in the North American market, is the geography. Where and how many fuel stations do you place to be able to take advantage of hydrogen refueling? Well, in Japan, you're on an island. You don't need as many hydrogen fuel refilling stations to cover the entire country. And then you look at Korea, South Korea, it's much the same. It's a peninsula. And oh, by the way, you really don't want to go too far north. So for all intents and purposes, it's also an island and can be covered by a minimal number of hydrogen fuel stations. And those hydrogen fuel stations can also support hydrogen ICE. Since they still already have ICE in place with hybrids, then hydrogen ICE does kind of have a place more so in the Japan, South Korea market than it would in either Europe or China or North America.
But don't you think Japan and Korea would be crazy to go off on a hydrogen ICE or even a hydrogen fuel cell for passenger vehicles or light vehicles if the rest of the world doesn't go that way? I mean, can they really afford to put all the facilities in place to make cars that can only be sold in those countries?
I think that's the stress that Toyota's feeling now. Biggest market, North America, is quickly going to zero emission and focusing that zero emission push towards battery electric, not fuel cell, while for Toyota, the home market is clearly a sweet spot for hydrogen fuel cell. And I think they're in a position now where they're forced to play both sides. They have to have product in both formats.
But I mean, you say, the situation that Toyota faces, and, it seems to me that when they came out with the Prius, everybody said, oh, that's crazy. Why would you do that? That's insane, right? And you look at Prius sales last year in this market, right? And I think guys at General Motors would wish that they had stuck with the hybrid technology. In South Korea, I mean, the number one selling hydrogen vehicle in the world right now is the Nexo, which comes from Hyundai. And John, you were mentioning earlier, okay, how do these guys make the switch? Well, reporting out of South Korea in December basically had it that Hyundai decided that their CAP-P powertrain CAP-T team was now the electrical development team, and that the engine development center now is the battery development center. Like, these guys are saying, we're going all in, and
all in electric, you mean?
All in electric, but in terms of different flavors, right? I mean, so it could be a fuel cell vehicle, or it could be, a full battery electric vehicle. But I mean, basically, you do have batteries in fuel cell vehicles, and so the technology plays both ways. So James, I just wonder whether it isn't conceivable that you could have a market-based vehicle that you would just sell in a region and ignore the rest of the world?
It's possible, but I remember the Honda Clarity, and in its last couple of years of the first gen, remember what they did? You could get a Clarity as a plug-in hybrid, you could get a Clarity as a BEV, or you can get a Clarity as a fuel cell. And when you're working with architectures that are based on the skateboard concept, like most more modern battery electric vehicles are, then you can possibly have that flexibility if you develop the skateboard to be sort of agnostic as to whether it's powered by battery or powered by hydrogen. So I would be surprised if Hyundai and possibly even Toyota doesn't look further into that direction.
James, are you looking at how do you see the government, if people don't want to buy EVs in the volume and the cadence and the rate that we see coming in terms of new vehicle programs? And like John mentioned, it could be 10 years, it could be longer than that. How do you see the industry and government kind of nudging the consumer this way?
Yeah, and speaking, specifically for North America, I think that we're going to be in that zone for a while where both technology platforms are available. As I mentioned, we've got areas of this country where people don't have ready access to electricity to plug their EV in every night. You've got people that live in large cities where not everybody lives on the first floor. And you're not going to run an extension cord from a fifth floor apartment to plug in your electric vehicle.
Some people will, though.
Yeah.
So for those people, a hybrid makes perfect sense. Now, other than GM, the other major domestic players have not said that they're all in on going full zero emissions. So with Ford, you're going to have, for the foreseeable future, hybrid, plug-in hybrid, battery electric. We expect that Stellantis is going to go the same direction. The issue with government, to get back to your original question about, how does this play with the government? We've got states that are saying, pick a year, ban on sale of new ICEs. California started it. There are other states that are in that same mindset that are pushing that. The thing that I'm seeing when I look at that, though, is in each case, it's executive order, which means it isn't enforced by law. Mm-hmm. Legislature makes law, not the executive branch. The thing is, though, when you look at how automakers are behaving, none of them are pushing back on these executive orders, which leads me to believe that they aren't going to push back should it become legislation, or they're not pushing back now in the expressed hope that it never becomes legislation, that it just becomes an executive order that is an aspiration that for practical reasons might never be realized.
Mm-hmm. Do you see, though, people saying, well, if I can't get my combustion engine F-150 anymore, I'm just going to drive the one I have, which is going to create just more vehicle emissions per mile as the fleet gets older? I mean, you really can't force people into these things. And I really figure that it's going to be retail price as much as charging availability and everything else. That's, the prices of these things, the price delta, $10,000 a vehicle or more, has just got to come down. And if it doesn't, who's going to want to buy an electric vehicle?
Well, I think that's going to manifest itself in a different way. What's going to happen, you're sitting there with your F-150 and your neighbor buys a Lightning and your neighbor on the other side buys a Silverado EV, and you're all driving trucks. And as you're comparing how things go, you start to realize that they're spending less over the life cycle of that Ford Lightning or that Silverado EV than you are. They're not having to service the exhaust. They're not having to service oil. They're not having to service any of the systems that exist in an ICE vehicle that no longer exist on the EV. And oh, by the way, they wake up every morning with a full range full driving range, that they might not actually drive that entire range in the course of a week while you're stopping at the gas station and filling up with 87 or 93 octane, depending on what engine you're driving. So over time, that reality starts to sink in, and you're also noticing that everything you're doing with your truck, they're doing with their trucks. So there isn't a loss of capability. The only thing that you can do that they can't do is make a long trip that goes beyond the range of your vehicle in a single day.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well,
And that's a big deal. But that initial retail price delta, I can put a lot of exhaust systems and replace my brakes and tires on my F-150 before I've even come close to paying. Gary and John and I have a colleague who just ordered a Lightning. It's going to be almost $90,000. It's just,
well, James,
outside the range of a lot of people.
Do you see anything that would take the price of EVs down to, say, Lindsay's, $10,000 to make the reduction? Is there a technology, or is it just to be a matter of scale?
Scale is going to play into it, but I think at the end of the day, what we're seeing from automakers is going to be a reliance on total cost of ownership. So you may never have sticker for sticker price parity. You may get close, but there's not a real incentive to have sticker to sticker price parity if you can appropriately tell the total cost of operation story. If you can demonstrate to a customer that they can attain that parity or even that advantage in TCO within 2 or 3 years of purchase, it's probably an easy story.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think people outside of Lindsay understand that?
I'm gonna say no, because let's look at what we see and have seen for decades when people in the North American market buy a car. The sticker is king, except for that little piece in the corner that tells you how much your fuel's going to cost every year. That seems to be largely ignored. And if you want to, for example, suggest to someone that I can reduce the price of the fuel that you have to buy over the life cycle of this vehicle, if you just pay a little bit more for a technology that will improve your fuel economy, no sale. You give me 15 more horsepower, I'll give you a couple $100.
So
Even
James,
after you tell me that 15 extra horsepower is going to cost me another $100 a year in fuel.
hey, I want to go back to my Hail Mary question. What about some of these really exotic engine designs like Acadies? Or in December, Gary and I had these guys on from Astron Aerospace that have this sort of radial engine design that the viewership went gaga over. Do you hold out any hope for engines like those?
I'll say that I'm bearish on those. And the main reason why it has nothing to do with the technology, has nothing to do with the value of the technology. I would never push back on that. But look at what the major OEMs are doing right now. They're throwing billions with a B at developing skateboard architectures. They're walking away from, in some cases, brand new architectures, ICE-based architectures, Omega, in the face of spending more money to get to the skateboard-based architectures that they're going to pin their battery electric futures on. So something like an Acadies or the other engine you mentioned would have to have a super compelling story to put the brakes on that type of investment, that level of investment happening that soon, and turn that whole ship around. Mm-hmm. I just don't see it happening. And again, it is no reflection on the value of those technologies. It's just that we're down that road already.
Yeah.
So these guys see the end game being electric, and these alternatives would simply be supplements on the way there.
I'm not sure they'd even be supplements, because and I'm using Acadies again as an example. There's architectural platform changes that you have to make to accept those new technologies. And the automakers are not in the mode of spending money to upgrade or create new ICE-based architectures. They're laser focused on new battery-focused architectures. Now, some of the European luxury manufacturers are working on mixed platforms, that multi-energy platforms that can accept electric, can accept ICE, but even then you'd have to restructure those architectures to take something as different as an Acades engine.
I'm just thinking,
they're doing that.
you got all those factories full of machine tools, and the Acades engine lends itself to milling and drilling and boring, and so you're, oh, it's a big money save. We don't have to throw the machines away.
Yeah. And that would be, again, the attraction of hydrogen ICE too. That, again, you know how to make cylinder blocks and cylinder heads and crankshafts. And if you can just change from gasoline to hydrogen in that ICE engine, yeah, that all makes sense. You save the equipment, you save the factory, but you still have emissions.
Yeah. Hey,
James,
look,
I know-
we take a
go
quick
ahead, John.
commercial break here. We're going to come back to it. This is a great topic. There's more to ask James on this, but first a shout out to our great sponsor, Bridgestone. Okay, we're back with James Martin from IHS Markit, talking all about the last stages of the ice age. James, you've talked about the skateboard platforms. You also talked about some automakers are going with flexible platforms that can accommodate, in ICE, HEV, PHEV, BEV. What are your thoughts in that regard? Because my thought is the flexible platform thing probably made sense 3 or 4 years ago. My own personal opinion is, if you haven't bit the bullet and gone with a skateboard completely designed from scratch for EV, you're screwed.
Yeah, I think what you're doing there is you're leaving some efficiencies on the table. If you don't, wrap it around a skateboard architecture with the battery box integral to the structure of the frame and even being a load-bearing entity. But if you're a medium volume manufacturer and you have to produce ICE-based vehicles and you have to produce battery electric vehicles, do you really want to go through the expense of having two very different platforms? So you find the best way you can to optimize those platforms into a single basic design, basic design focus, and put your best foot forward. Mercedes at the CES, they showed a concept vehicle that focused on the efficiency of that vehicle, and I'm not certain, but I don't think that was a skateboard architecture. I could be wrong there. I may have to go back and check.
Well, let me state it this way: skateboard, whatever. What I'm talking about is clean sheet design to be a BEV from the get-go versus a platform that's designed to accommodate multiple powertrains. And I think if you have the multiple powertrain accommodating platform, you've got, what they call scar mass.
Exactly.
So your BEV is just not going to be as efficient. Moreover, if you have a plant dedicated to making only EVs, you're going to pick up a 25 to 30% productivity advantage. And that's why I understand what you're saying, that it's more expensive to go the clean sheet design like I'm talking about, but you come out the other end with a much more efficient EV that's built at much lower cost.
And I agree with you, John. And that's why I brought up the Mercedes as an example. They focused on the efficiency of that vehicle and the design. They focused on it getting really twice the mileage per kilowatt burned, if you burn kilowatts. not quite like gas, but the efficiency of that vehicle. And my thinking was that part of that message was that even if this is a mixed, a multi-energy platform, they can still achieve the efficiencies of a battery electric on a dedicated platform.
Right. So
I think
basically,
that was
we're
part of
talking
it.
here about, I think John is thinking about basically taking an existing ICE platform and saying, oh, we'll do all these other things with it, versus someone, maybe Mercedes, saying, okay, we're going to design something clean sheet, but when we design it, we're going to design it so it can do these things. Now, maybe it won't be as optimally set up for one or the other, but when there are people like Lindsay who will never buy an electric vehicle, we got something for him.
Not true, Gary. Not true. I'm
Close.
I have a hybrid coming. That's the first step. But I think the conversation's interesting, James, because we have this example right now. We've got Silverado EV, which is a dedicated EV platform. It comes in one cab configuration and one bed configuration. And we've got Ford going with Lightning, which is adapting a ladder chassis, which can accommodate every bed and cab configuration that Ford offers, all-wheel drive, the whole 9 yards, and still accommodates an electric battery. Do you see Ford going towards the GM architecture? Do you see GM saying, well, wait a minute, boy, we've lost 100,000 buyers out there because they can't get the long bed and the short cab?
I think that where we are there, typical for GM, they're not showing you the whole portfolio with the first launch. There's going to be a lot more to the Silverado EV in terms of cab and bed configurations than what was shown at the EV launch. So I think what we're going to wind up seeing is that they're both taking a different approach to launch, but at the end of the day, they're going to end up in the same place. Their electric trucks are going to have multiple cab configurations, multiple bed configurations, and multiple power levels. So,
Plus, we also know Ford's working on a skateboard truck chassis.
yes.
And my understanding is it's not going to be ready until about 2025. Right. They took the route that they did to take an F-150, gut it, stuff it through the batteries, and call it a Lightning because it gave them first mover advantage over GM, which took a clean sheet design approach.
Right.
And so Ford will beat GM to the market, and it's getting all kinds of kudos for that. My personal opinion is that when the Silverado EV debuts, it'll be a superior electric pickup to what Ford's offering.
Yeah, I agree with that. But we're in this period where it's a big question mark in terms of how long this transitory period is going to be. Right. Yeah. And not only vehicle price, but configuration. Am I going to get the vehicle that I want, particularly in trucks, which is basically a custom-made vehicle, and that's one of the advantages of pickups right now. So I don't argue with any of this. I don't argue that EVs are the future. I'm just looking at this long transition. We talked about jobs. I think the sub-tier suppliers are really going to take it on the chin with this transition. The guys that make clips and springs. We haven't talked about planetary automatics, but I'm told that your latest study has shown that we're peaked right now at planetary automatic volume, that it descends every year from here. So we're seeing a real big change, and it's not going to be pretty in some areas. It's going to be great for vehicles, and I think it's going to be great for the environment, et cetera, at the end of this transition. But the transition could be very long.
Yeah, you're right, Gary. The transition. When we last met in 19 and had this similar conversation, I was projecting the transition being a fairly long transition, that it would probably take a couple decades, at least a decade and a half, couple decades to make that transition. A couple things have happened since then. I don't think in that discussion in 2019, any of us said the words carbon neutral. Mm-hmm. And I don't think any of us said the words last mile delivery. And we
didn't say Biden administration either.
Well, now here's the thing. Carbon neutral happened before Biden administration. And GM's declaration of zero emissions, zero crashes, zero congestion happened before Biden administration. And those are two of the biggest drivers in the acceleration of the move towards electrification. Those things happened late 2019, and early 2020, clearly before the election. So we were already on that path.
Yeah. You know, I'm with you on that. I thought the transition would take longer. Where I miscalculated, and you already brought it up, James, how many countries are banning sales of the internal combustion engine? And in some cases, I believe it is legislative. I think Norway, 2025, they're the first out of the blocks with the ban. The other thing I miscalculated on, or didn't take into account, was how willingly governments would shovel out all kinds of incentives to buy these things and build up an electric infrastructure. But knowing what we know now, that it's coming faster and OEMs are faced with a dilemma, here's what I want to ask you. Volvo has already spun off its ICE operations, spun it off into its parent company, Geely. But, you know, I wrote an editorial for Ward's about a year or so ago saying that the Detroit 3 should spin off their powertrain operations, their ICE operations, standalone company, or maybe you sell it to a Cummins or something, get it off their books, have a company that is solely dedicated to ICE powertrains, that is going to ride this all the way into the sunset, and let them concentrate on where they really want to go, which is EV right now. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really interesting question, John. And if I go back to before I retired from GM, that was in 2017, those conversations were, I'd say they weren't totally muted, but they were happening at a low level at GM, that, you know, this is a direction that's being suggested. There wasn't a lot of movement on it at GM at the time, but it's interesting that those conversations are coming back again. And then when GM acquired Cruise, I had one foot out the door by that time. Those conversations started again. Is this a sign of GM spinning off, making Cruise the, quote, high-tech electrified version of the company, and old GM, again, OGM part 2, I guess, would be, stays with ICE, and then again with GM BrightDrop. So, you know, these conversations keep coming up, and I think it becomes a question then of whether, as a leadership team, you've got a team that's focused on stock price and market valuation, or whether you've got a leadership team that's focused on putting the best product in the customer's hands. And I'd say that so far, where GM has fallen on this is still being focused on putting the best products in the customer's hands. I don't have any insight on where Ford or Stellantis would be on that. So
is there a model? Is there a model, James, with some of the tier ones, and, you know, Conti did the same thing, and what had been Delphi with Aptiv and so forth. And it wasn't like those companies got a huge boost on Wall Street when they did that, right?
I don't know that the parent company, the quote old tech companies did, and I'll be honest, I haven't tracked the stocks on most of the new companies. So I
can jump in here and tell you, Aptiv is the most highly valued supplier company in the world. You know, Magna is gigantic. It's hard to track, like Bosch. Bosch is not publicly traded. It's a privately held company. Yeah. So is it Schaeffler too? I think is the same. But
yeah, family run.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Magna, we got all the numbers on it. The last I looked, it was valued at about $24 billion, give or take. Aptiv is $40 billion. So, I mean,
that's interesting. Yeah.
The market capitalization, I mean, the market loves the Aptiv story. And that's very tempting for other companies to do the same thing.
Well, speaking of suppliers, James, I'm wondering, you know, is there sufficient competence out there for the OEMs to tap into, to whether it's to go to an all-electric future, or, you know, you mentioned autonomy, and part of your mandate now is to look at mobility. I mean, it just seems to me that they're entering a world that they're not necessarily familiar with, and I just wonder whether there are going to be the means by which they can actually put what they're talking about on the street.
I think we're seeing it. I think we're seeing it today. You know, Markit is an example of Ford. engineering a product from the ground up, battery electric in the face of a lot of staunch competition. Tesla Y is an excellent product, and hardly a week goes by when somebody isn't on YouTube comparing Mach-E to Tesla Y, and it holds its own. It wins some, it loses some, but it's a very, very strong right out of the box product. If you look at the product that GM's got coming down the pipeline, and if you look at the things that Stellantis is saying that they're looking to do with electrification, for Stellantis to stand up in this time where we've got, some very strong horsepower wars, and say, we see an end to the Hemi. We see an end to the Hellcat, because we're developing electric vehicles to replace those vehicles. I think that the domestic automakers, have strong footing to say, we know how to do this and we're going to get it done.
Hey, speaking of Hemi, I've got to ask you this while you're on here, and talking about a replacement for that. Stellantis has had this inline six in development for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Allegedly to be built in Mexico. What's the status of that? And I know you probably can't talk about clients and everything else, but that's a real mystery.
I can say this because it was a response that they made. Talking to a different media outlet, one of the Stellantis executives, when asked about that engine, said, "Are you going to be in New York?" So that leads me to believe that they're going to release the GME T6 3-liter inline twin turbo at the New York Auto Show, and hopefully I'll be there to see that.
And James, do you see that as kind of an interim replacement for the Hemi, which really carries the ball in terms of RAM?
I'm not sure if that's going to be, and I'd have to speak with some more of our more focused forecasting team, whether we're seeing that targeted most for SUVs, or if it's also going to be a pickup engine. Because again, where we started today's discussion, how do you manage that balance of taking down entire platforms of engines? Right. Stellantis has to be very careful with how they take the Hemi line. And remember, there's 3 Hemis. There's the 5.7, there's the 6.4, and then there's the 6.2 supercharged. And they were speaking specifically around the 6.2 supercharged being replaced by an electric powertrain. They have not really said where the GME T6 is slotting in. What I've seen in my prior time forecasting engines is that it's likely to replace the 5.7, and that would be likely in trucks and SUVs. But when you're talking about taking down a complete platform, there's a whole ecosystem that you have to be careful around how you manage that. If I'm telling war stories here, one of the most fun assignments I had, you guys remember the C4 ZR1?
Oh yeah.
I had the responsibility to develop a plan to take the LT5 engine out of production. I was actually at Stillwater at Mercury Marine when the last engines came off the line, because my team was buying them to package them up and put them in storage for warranty service. And that was actually just kind of the cherry on top of the whole pie of making that into production plan. But in bringing that engine out of production, we wound up having to spend a lot of time working with existing suppliers, explaining to them that your volume is going from here to 0 in this amount of time.
That's tough.
Or that, and this was an even tougher message for some of them, but we still need you to support service. We still need you to to support warranty replacement of components. And it was very difficult for those suppliers. Some of them went out of business during the process. Some of them went out of business before the engines left the line. And we had to work with new suppliers to produce things like cylinder heads and crankshafts and cylinder blocks in what were basically prototype volumes so that the service parts community could be supported. That was just one version of a platform of engines. Now, take instead of that something like, I don't know, say the Ford Fox engine. I'll pick on that one because it's not sold here in North America. But the Ford Fox engine, when it debuted, was projected to become Ford's highest volumes engine globally. Ford has also said that they're going to zero emission vehicles in Europe, which means the Fox engine is going to wind its way out of production at some point in time in the very near future. That has to be managed not only within Ford, but it has to be managed with every supplier that's on that project. And it's got to be done in a way that when those suppliers finally turn off the lights, it's not before Ford is done with their obligation of fitting those vehicles in those engines in the last vehicles that are to get them, and also supporting the serviceability of those engines in the customer's hands. So it's a really tight balance that's got to be played here as you take these multiple ICE platforms and wind them down over how many years. And I'm thinking we're talking 12, 15, possibly 20 years in some cases to wind these programs all the way down without obliterating your supply base, or without your supply base becoming disconnected and threatening the OEM's supply of parts to make vehicles. It's a very delicate balance.
Hey, we're getting down towards the end here, but you talked about the Hellcat going away, other performance cars that's going to happen. You're a gearhead. If I remember right, you're a Camaro guy.
I'm a Camaro guy.
So what do you think, James? Are you going to buy these electric things, or what is going to happen there?
I would buy one. The Camaro sits in my garage. It's probably the loudest car on the block. It sits next to a Chevrolet Volt that is the quietest car on the block. So, I've got a foot in each camp.
So it's the performance of the electric that would attract you?
I have confidence that the domestic automakers can make a high-performing electric vehicle. I mean, look at the Hummer. 9,000-pound vehicle that can do 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. I mean, come on.
That's right. Well, good. Well, I think we should probably wrap this up.
John, can I ask one more question?
Jump in, Lindsay. Sorry.
If we have a second, okay. Talking about this inline six Stellantis engine, I've got to ask you about hybrid Corvette. And I can't wait to talk to Mark Royce when they finally introduce this, because he really said, we're done with hybrids. And I'm told by many sources that is coming, hybrid C8. So what do you know about that?
We think it's coming. We're very sure it's coming. And I think the story there is that vehicle was deep in development before GM made the shift to zero emissions. So rather than pull the plug on that, it's full speed ahead. It's going to happen. I really, really, really hope they call it Grand Sport. And there's a reason for that. It's because I really don't want him to call it E-Ray.
That's all right. Well, let's wrap this up. James Martin, brilliant having you on the show again. I love your insight. I love the different ways that you look at things. Terrific to have you on the show.
Agreed.
Yes, thanks, James.
Oh, I enjoy it. Enjoy talking with you guys. Let's do it again.
Well, we will. We'll do it again. We won't wait a couple of years either. Lindsay, always great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's always good to be here.
Yeah. And Gary, you and I are just going to keep on doing this.
Do it next week.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, and you can tune in next week for more.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Visit our website, Autoline.tv, where you can watch us live Thursday afternoons. Get your daily fix with Autoline Daily and in-depth analysis and interviews with Autoline This Week. There's all that and much more at Autoline.tv.